Hello, everyone. This is Noor Musa.
And this is Rachel Sider. Welcome to Confused About Syria. Confused About Syria is a 5-episode series talking about two aid workers' experience working on Syria, trying to make sense of recent events and their future implications.
Hello again. This is Noor. Maybe you remember me from Confused Iraqi podcast or more recently, Confused About Yemen. In this season, I am joined by Rachel again to talk about Syria.
Hi, everyone. I'm a fellow aid worker who lived and worked across the Middle East, including in Syria. So, Noor, why are we discussing Syria today, and why did you want to make this the focus of the 3rd season?
To start with, I'm sure this is going to be a challenging conversation, not only because Syria is under the radar now and everybody is monitoring, excited for the future, but also worried about certain events and developments, but also because of the connection to the place, the personal connection to the people, to the country, to its history, and care for its future. I have so many Syrian people in my life. Even my Iraqi accent is extremely impacted. I speak half Syrian, half Iraqi because of these connections that are still in my life, even though that I'm not in Syria currently. I also have a Syrian cat. I brought him with me from Syria. So I feel like Syria is in my life and I don't want to take it out of my life. Hence, we are talking about Syria. We will center the discussion on Syria, the potential the country has for the future, also looking into the foundation for its strength, the resilience of its people, and the political dynamics that could impact its future, to reflect on what lessons can be learned from a country that is not only on the border with Syria, but also has shared similar experiences, has gone through the very similar challenges, and how the recovery of Iraq can bring lessons for Syria's recovery, and reflect on this not only from Iraq, but also from my experience being an Iraqi, interacting with Iraqis and seeing how these policies, global, regional, national policies that have been adopted, how they impacted Iraqis, and reflecting on these and what we see is could be also being replicated now in Syria, and how that replication could be avoided or altered in a way that serve the greater good of Syrians. I do understand from my personal experience working in Syria that there are differences between Syria and Iraq, multiple differences, but I do also want to focus on the similarities here and the human experience, living under oppressive regimes, the immigration, and living under the impact of sanctions, and trying to rebuild a country that is almost under rubble, country that lost its resources, its connection to the world, many of its people. So I want to bring these together and try to see, through talking through some of the decisions that we're taking on Syria, what lessons we can take from Iraq and just put them out there. But hopefully someone can listen to this conversation and reflect on them further in a way that can help Syria.
So across these 5 episodes, I think what listeners can expect from us is a bit of a journey into Syria's identity, into its experience of 14 years of war, the moment of rupture that we saw in early December 2024, and some of the tough realities of the transition that it's now experiencing, and the big choices that come about its future. And along the way, these episodes will really center on the experiences both in Syria that we've had and with Syrians, in the country, in displacement, among the diaspora. And I hope that through the course of our conversation, we can also confront some of the political, humanitarian, and moral dilemmas that are now shaping the post-conflict recovery process. This is not simply a story of war, and there are so many of those out there and many of the places where we've worked previously, but because of the journeys that we've had with Syria, this is really a story also of culture, of resilience, of mistakes that have been made elsewhere, as you've mentioned, in Iraq, and the urgency of really getting this right. In episode 1, we'll consider Syria beyond its connotations of war to appreciate how rich its culture, its traditions, and history coexist alongside some of those challenges. Episode 2 examines how 2011 unfolded from the perspective of Syrians themselves and the implications of that war on many Syrians in the country and in the wider region. In episode 3, we tackle the events surrounding December 8th, 2024, and the confusion, rumors, fear, and hope surrounding the fall of the regime. Episode 4 offers a sober look at the ongoing transition, not simply as an idea, but as a lived, contested process shaped by some of the hard choices and heavy politics we're seeing today. And in our last episode, we'll more explicitly focus on tough lessons emanating from Iraq's own difficult transition as we learn from the mistakes of the past and shape Syria's future.
Now we move on to talking about how this culture, history, identity you've just described shaped Syria. But let's start talking about this through our own experience first. So it would be good to hear from you, Rachel. If you can remember what ideas and information you had on Syria before going there and how these were challenged or confirmed when you were in Syria.
Yeah, so I think what's different about this episode compared to our last season was that we both got involved with Syria before we became humanitarian aid workers. And before that was a core aspect of our identity. And for me, that was largely through the lens of being a student in the United States, where I was really pulled into some of the early research around what became the Civil War in its very early days as both a student of Arabic and a student of the Middle East. And my earliest memories of Syria were around this really complex dilemma that many Syrians were facing as to how to challenge a system that had been repressive and silencing them for such a long time in a way that could possibly yield change and hope for the future, and was following the early days of the protests from the perspective of wanting Syrians to succeed in that mission, and also through the lens of someone who was trying to apply political science theory and largely Western frameworks to make sense of what we were seeing. And ultimately, I think there were some real limitations to doing so. But what about your experience, Noor, as someone who, of course, lived much more proximate to Syria and I have to imagine encountered the country and its people way earlier in life than I did?
So my experience, I will just take us on a short journey to my childhood. As we know, I grew up under Saddam Hussein regime, another Ba'athist regime, but his regime didn't like the regime, the only other Ba'athist regime in the area. So we didn't really learn much about Syria. We only focused on Iraq. My education, most of what I've seen, the news, people around me, we were only talking about Iraq. We didn't learn much about Syria, but we were watching some series. And because of the accent, the Syrian accent is more similar to, it's a Levant accent, so Jordan and Lebanon. So I never associated Syria and Iraq. So I really didn't see connections. And then growing up, I started seeing Iraqis who came back to Iraq after 2003. And they were telling me how they loved Syria, the nature, the fresh air, the culture, the food. So I've learned about these aspects a bit, not much. And then obviously 2011 happened. And it was devastating. In the beginning, it was normal what was happening there. Many other Arab countries, we saw people going in the street and protesting. So it was normal. It was good for the people. They are protesting. They want change. And then things escalated in a way. I chose to distance myself. And I don't say this with pride, but it became too complicated for me to comprehend because I didn't have much understanding on Syria. So going to Syria wasn't by choice, 100%. I always hesitated about going to Syria, working in Syria. I never visited Syria before going on that mission. I was offered going to Syria despite me applying to another role somewhere else. And I had many Syrian friends outside of Syria, and I had to ask them what they think. Despite that, everyone I met outside of Syria, and I met people who were from different groups. I met Sunnis, I met Christians, I met Kurds, I met Alawites. Everybody didn't like what was happening in Syria. Everyone wasn't very okay with them going to Syria or sending people there. But they were okay with me to go there because they understood this is a humanitarian mission and everyone in Syria needs help, despite where you are. This is mainly a war on civilians. So I was happy to see that my friends encouraged me to go there, knowing that they are against the government there. When I went there, I have to say I was very scared because I grew up in Iraq, and one thing you learn from growing up in Iraq is that you have to be concerned and scared from intelligence. You don't speak to anyone. You don't say whatever you think. Some people might just drag you into a conversation. So going back to Syria, I had to, I wouldn't say relive because I was a child in Iraq when that intelligence system was very active, but I've seen them coming to our house, my mother alone having to deal with security who just come and, and inspect everything and check everything. It was regular in Iraq that forces come to your house, despite my father was in the military. So it was very shocking for me. Like, even when you're part of the country, like you're in the military and they come still inspect you and harass your family. And it was very, very regular, but it was shocking for me to see, but I didn't interact with it much. I heard a lot of stories. So going to Syria, it wasn't easy for me to prep myself for that, to be surveyed, and my visa took so many months to be approved. But I eventually went there. And I would say the first thing for me was how beautiful Damascus was. I heard it from so many colleagues that Damascus is one of the best cities they've been to. It's an amazing city. And in the first few weeks, I was like, I always thought Baghdad is the best city in the world. And now I'm second guessing that. It's very beautiful. And then and then fortunately, I was able to travel across the different part of the countries and discovered how diverse the country is and how in certain parts I felt at home. Like I went to Qamishli and Hasaka, and the accent, the food was very similar to Kurdistan region of Iraq and part of Iraq that I felt I am in Iraq. And I would say on that level, it was a pleasant experience exploring the culture and the people, but I was scared being there. I was a bit concerned that my phone is being monitored, my communication with my family, and then at some point we'll talk about this in later episodes. Syria started to be attacked by Israeli forces and became unsafe, and then different events happened. So the journey really was overwhelming. But my first reaction was how beautiful is this country and how sad the sanctions impact is on the people. Like I have never seen that many people going through bins, in the street and just looking for anything, It was very, very, very sad. And the cars, how old the cars are, how old everything is, People didn't get the chance to renovate, to rebuild, because they didn't know where the future was headed.
I think we both share this experience of having developed an impression of Syria from the outside and then having to reconcile that with the realities once we arrived, especially because we were encountering Syria in a moment of real crisis, right? But I think at the same time, a lot of the richness and the beauty and the memory of Syria's past and its legacy in the region was still very much present throughout our time there.
Yes, and there are so many elements to why we learned about the context while being there, because that diversity is not being celebrated enough, is not being shown enough. And I think the war and the borders and have created some divide and some focus on certain issues, and sometimes at the cost of neglecting foundations to Syria that should be celebrated and built on. Like, for example, how diverse is this country is, how many languages there are, how many religion groups there are, and how harmonious these communities. When you visit certain parts of the country, you see them living together for hundreds of years. I should have actually, as an Iraqi, I should have thought that Syria, being on the same border, on the same geography, like Iraq, it should share a historical background. So we do have diverse groups of diverse religion groups, diverse ethnicities. So I should have thought that it's the same in Syria, but I didn't really explore it before going to Syria. And it was great to go to Syria and see there are more groups at some locations. I haven't really interacted with Ismailis and Druze in Iraq. There are more Christian groups in Syria. There are groups in Iraq that are not in Syria, but it was interesting for me to see that this is something in common. Different communities who've been there for hundreds, thousands of years. Their experience is very valid, and we have to inform ourselves of their history. But unfortunately, when you interact with the context through war, media, and political developments, you don't look farther into these communities and their experience. And sometimes they are used by different conflict parties to legitimize their position And that is, I think, in Syria, this is the biggest case where one group has been looked on in a certain way because the leadership is from that group. And I met people who are Alawite outside of Syria, who are completely against that leadership and didn't accept what was happening. And I have friends who swore that they wouldn't go back to Syria unless he's out. And they were from the group that has been used to create that divide and cause harm to others under the name of sectarianism and leveraging all that. For me, that was a great thing to see, that there is there's diversity, not only within one within religion, but within one religion also in Syria. That was very educational being there. And I should have thought as an Iraqi, because I come from Iraq, that that diversity is there and it has been used. Because in our case, there were this grouping based on religion and ethnicity has been used in Iraq. Another thing that I've also should have, I think I feel ashamed to admit this, but at the same time I should, because other people might go through similar experiences and we need to pay attention to actually asking the right questions to the right people. When I went to Syria, and I remember the first few days, and my mother called me, is like, how is Syria? I told her, it's interesting, there are many females everywhere I go, and I didn't pay attention to it. I didn't overthink it. I just thought it's fine. Like, there are so many females in the streets. And like, no, that means less men. And I didn't see this in other cities. It's usually more men than females in the Middle East, especially when you go out at night. And I never had a conversation with someone in the inside of Syria who told me, can't you see it? And not actually explaining to me. I was telling people like, no, there are so many females. Nobody told me, like, because men are imprisoned, they've been killed. You know what is
They've
happening?
been conscripted.
Exactly. And so after December 8th, when there were much more men than women in the street. And there were women who were fully covered with the niqab I haven't seen before. So I was able to see the diversity in the street. I was able to see Syria that you see when you travel across the country in Damascus. While before it was one version of it. So that was something I should have actually explored more and learned more about, because I was in Syria. So I should have asked these questions and tried to understand that it's not normal that there are many females and very few male, and most of them are older, and they were doing heavy jobs. These old men, they were the cleaners, the ones who are working in shops and in hard labor jobs. And it was sad, but that says a lot about a country. But if you just go and see the country quickly, not really stay in it and see how things progress, I think that's a key here, because you cannot just judge one country, especially a country like Syria, in a certain way unless you see it through history. And just going back to these groups and what is happening currently in Syria, you cannot be fair to a group if you just look at what happened to them during the last 10 years. You have to go back hundreds of years and see how history has impacted their life, who was there, how they were being used by these different players throughout history. And that's the best way to look at Syria, through a complete history, because otherwise you will be discriminating and picking sides.
I share those feelings, Nora. I think also because my only experience in Syria is when it has been engulfed in crisis and conflict. I think a lot of my Syrian friends have tried to share stories with me as to what it was like before the conflict and certainly farther back in history. And this is just the limitation of my experience and my knowledge, right? But I think a lot of the stories that they tell have been in the context of also the limitations of what was possible in terms of freedom of expression before 2011, right? And how it really deeply rooted in culture is an understanding of how the politics and the silencing of the politics can allow for certain things to be said and others less so. And I remember being in a class in university where we were studying some of the origins of satire in the Middle East and how a lot of the more comedic forms of expression really have their origins in some of these Syrian comedians who have found ways in what was called masrah tanfisi to really create an opening in which, even in a very repressive environment, certain forms of political commentary and satire were still tolerated by the previous regime, in part because there was a recognition that some of us need to laugh at the end of the day, and that some of this is actually the releasing of a pressure valve, to translate that phrase kind of in Arabic. I remember watching some of these shows and recognizing actually how sophisticated and intellectual some of the forms of culture have had to be to find and to tread that fine line between criticism and creativity. And I think that's a real gem of what Syria has also contributed in terms of culture across the Arab world.
And in the Arab world, for us, unfortunately, before 2011, Syria was so big on drama, and it took a few years of a pause, but then they came back very strong and continue to be. But for us in the Arab region, that Syrians are the best storytellers. Syrian acting is great. Syrian TV is great because the amazing thing about Syrians is that they can reflect heavy emotions with ease. When you watch a Syrian drama, you feel it's not acting. It's that good. And I loved you gave that example because I can easily see it, because it's just these people have been through a lot, and probably that history shaped how they communicate the stories and how they feel different emotions, even if it's not theirs, and they can act it. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to more Syrian storytelling in the future. I think now there is a better chance for Syrian TV to show some of these stories that we weren't able to see during the war. Another aspect I really wanted to touch upon, we touched upon the diversity in religion and ethnicities, and also and the capacity of Syrians to tell their stories. What is also very special about Syria, is geography and its environment. Again, I'm going to link it to Iraq. I should have also thought that because in Iraq we have diversity, some sort of diversity, like in the south, it's more farming lands, then you go in the center, it's a bit deserty, and then in the north is mountainy. So I should have actually also thought that Syria has that diversity, but I've seen mainly from TV Damascus, and the idea for us usually has been that Syria is an agricultural country, and it is. But it's also diverse naturally, that it's a Mediterranean country. I've only actually noticed that when I drove through Idlib. I never had the chance to go to Tartus and Latakia, but when we drove through Idlib and I saw the olive trees, I was like, wait, it's also a Mediterranean country. That this country continued to surprise me with the diversity in it. When I went to Hasaka and Qamishli, it's very similar to the deserty area in north of Iraq. Not north, it's just more Sinjar and Tal Afar areas, but also farming communities, and you see the mountains. It's very beautiful nature. So when it comes to diversity, as I said, it's not only about these different aspects of faith and ethnicity, it's this environmental diversity and the diversity in borders and the cultures across these different borders. And we will touch upon this a bit in details in the future, in future episodes, and how these different borders interacted with the Syrian crisis. But it is beautiful to see that if you drive a few kilometers here, east, west, north, or south, this country is connected deeply to this region. So you can never just say Syria should take care of itself. No, this is a regional country that has connections to the region, and everybody in this region should care about Syria, because these borders are new, but the connections are old. And you can see these connections when you are in Syria and traveling across. Rachel, you touched upon storytelling. And one big element of a storytelling in Syria, I would say, it's also the environment and the geography of the country and its connections to other regional countries. Now countries, the modern way of seeing things, before these borders didn't exist, these communities were closer to each other. And I had the privilege to travel across Syria, and every time I see myself east, west, north, south, I see the connection of the people in these different parts to the people across the border. So the ones in the north and their connection to Turkey, the ones on the east and their connection to Iraq, the ones in Daraa and Sweden, and these different parts and the similarities to Jordan. I'm not sure about Sweden. I've never been to Sweden actually, so I will not say Sweden, but in Daraa, they also have a mensef. And I've never had the chance to try it, but it's like in Syria, they have something that it's also the national dish for Jordan. It's a different way of making it, but you see the connection of this population to the rest of the region. So you cannot just look at Syria and Syrians and frame it with the Syrian border. It's a regional struggle, it's a regional story, it's a regional connection. So I think the environment also in Syria is very important. I'll just mention a colleague here I had. I was really impressed in his love of nature, memorizing all the trees and the flowers in Syria. And it made me notice how other Syrians interact with nature. And it's one of these Arab countries where you see people actually have plants in their houses for many years now. It became as a trend now that people buy plants and take care of them in their houses. But I think for Syria, this has been constant, their connection to nature, to growing things and farming and harvesting and cooking together and being together with nature is something that has to be also a part of Syria's stories and its future, because unfortunately droughts and climate change is impacting this, and we will touch upon climate change impact and it being an element of 2011 protests.
I share a lot of your reactions, Noor, because I also felt that Damascus was a little bit of a very charming, ancient, picturesque bubble in the sense that the streets were really alive with that sense of history. And a lot of my impressions of Damascus were actually informed by friends who had to flee there in early stages of the war and had described to me how the streets smelled like jasmine. And they were really reminiscent and nostalgic, I think, of that feeling. And then to contrast that with these really dry, kind of barren lands of the Northeast and parts of Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor, the heart of where the droughts really took hold, where Syria's breadbasket started to dry up. And of course, we know how that ended in terms of fueling urbanization and eventually some of the uprisings. But it reminds me that in many ways, not just in terms of geography, that Syria is a country of contrasts. And we see that, of course, in its natural beauty, but we also see it in the perspectives of many Syrians that we've encountered in the country. Those withstood over a decade of war in the capital and other parts of the country, in displacement, further afield, in exile, of course. And I think something that has been very striking in a lot of those encounters that I've had, and I've worked to understand this not just through storytelling, but I think also through spoken word and music and literature, and many of the ways that our Syrian friends and colleagues have found means of expressing some of these experiences, has been just something that seems to unite everyone, irrespective of where they are in the world and in place and time, is this enduring sense of belonging to Syria and a real pride for the country. It's something that seems to somehow transcend every individual's experience, their own personal identity, their own maybe traumas, their nostalgia, their hopes and their dreams. And even in exile, I think we see that is quite strong, if not even stronger as a result.
So, Rachel, for me, reflecting on all of these positive elements of diversity into Syria, and then reflecting on Syrians themselves, and then their strength and their pride in Syria, it made me remember something really important. And I only learned in the last few days of my time in Syria. I met farmer female in Aleppo, and she had 3 sons, adult sons, and one of them was in Turkey. And I asked her how things been to her, what she needs, and then I just digged a bit deeper. I was like, so how did things start for you, and like what happened? Because she started to tell me how her house was attacked multiple times, and she told me it was very quick. Like she had only a few seconds to decide what to do. The army was coming, the rebels were coming. She had 3 sons. She wants to protect them. In 30 seconds, she had to make a decision. And that made me realize that probably this is the experience of most Syrians, that they had very short window of time, very limited opportunities, if any, to take a decision that could change their life forever, but also could impact how they are being perceived. And how unfair all of this. It was disturbing for me to see in Syria when I went there after the fall of the regime, the finger pointing and the labeling of a rebel, of a terrorist, of a regime supporter, this labeling of each other, even happening among children in schools who weren't part of this, They're just copying the adults and not paying attention to, wait a second, most of us didn't have time or resources or a choice to make a decision in all of this. And we will explore more on that in the next episode. But when we think about Syrians, we should also think not only that they are amazing people and they have so much pride in their country, but whatever we think it's a decision they took, we really have to study or at least just try to ask what were the circumstances for that decision, because I'm sure these circumstances were difficult.
This has not been an easy episode to record. I think in part nor because both of us are coming at this topic from a place of deep love and care and concern for the country and its people in this moment and over the course of our careers and our lives. But I think at the same time, we see that there are a number of areas that are worth holding on to as we move into future episodes. And the first one is the beauty of Syria's diversity in the past, in the present, and how that will be reflected into the future. How, in the context of the conflict, some of those layers of diversity have been maybe reinforced, exposed, at risk of being lost, at times even maybe made more pronounced by external actors, and how we, in our own experiences of working in the country, encountered that and maybe saw some real contrasts in what that means for the future. At the same time, we also can see that that diversity is at times a double-edged sword and has been played into and reinforced in a way that risks fragmenting the country, whether that's along demographic lines or by reinforcing polarizations around who stayed and who was left behind and who chose to leave and who was forced to leave and who's gone back and who hasn't. And this reinforces how individualized this experience is for many Syrians, especially in the context of conflict. And I think a last impression from our discussion today is just the sense of pride and appreciation that Syrians continue to have for their country, for this strong sense of place that I think is very evident to all of us when we have the opportunity to visit Syria or to meet Syrians abroad in the diaspora, in displacement, and how a real strength of culture, of tradition, and of resilience comes through in everyone's personalities. I know that that is something that has carried me into some really beautiful friendships and professional relationships, and you as well, and that those are worth celebrating. And that sense of shared humanity is worth focusing on as we reflect on Syria's transition and the prospects it has for peace and stability.
Thanks, Rachel, for the always very valuable reflections. So we spoke a lot about diversity and why Syria has hope because of so many elements, including the biggest element, which is its people. In the next episode, we will move into exploring how the 2011 protests began, what regional interventions happened and how they shaped consequences and the outcomes from these protests and global implications of the war, and how all of these dynamics impacted Syria and Syrians within and beyond their country. So we hope you enjoyed this episode, and we'll be looking into further resources to learn more about Syria and its diversity. And we hope we see you in the next episode. Thank you for listening.